In the 1990s, there was a popular idea of Pax Americana, an era of American peace, where the US would act as the world's policeman and dictate what they wanted to the rest of the world. This was because with the collapse of the USSR, the US rose as the dominant superpower on the planet. The idea that democracy had triumphed over autocracy. Communism had been defeated. And as they say in kitschy American movies, the good guys achieved mission impossible. It was the end of history, as some people say. But now, 30 years later, it seems that things are a bit different. This was a time when people were celebrating. There was a party taking place at the top of society. But it's clear to say that the party is well and truly over, and here comes the hangover. Welcome to A World on Fire. I'm joined by Khalid, the London organiser of the RCP. How
Hello.
are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm good.
Any thoughts about this?
Yes. Great introduction. And I imagine that a lot of people's heads are a little bit sore in New York City today.
Yes.
After the stunning victory of Zohra Mamdani.
Absolutely.
Who,
a communist.
According to the Oval Office, is a communist.
Yes.
And I saw in
to
your...
them alone. According to them alone.
And I saw in your social media feed earlier this morning that people are wondering what you're doing in 2028 when the London mayoral elections are going to be taking place.
We'll have to see.
Anyway.
We'll have to see.
Let's begin with the 90s,
Yeah.
because as you say, this was a time of hubris for the American ruling class. And when you looked at what their ideologues were saying, there's some really kitschy things, like we're going to Coca-colonize the world now. There was a famous article in the New York Times in the 90s which said, no two countries that have ever had McDonald's have gone to war with one another.
Oh my God.
And so this really reflected a huge ideological offensive that the US imperialists were embarking on.
They were drunk on it.
They were drunk on it for sure. And there's, of course, that very famous speech by George Bush Sr. where he talks about the New World Order.
What is at stake is more than one small country. It is a big idea, a new world order, where diverse nations are drawn together in common cause to achieve the universal aspirations of mankind: peace and security, freedom, and the rule of law.
And within this, a very important plank was this question of world peace.
Yeah.
They began to pay lip service to world peace. And if you go back to the late 80s and the late 80s, early 90s, there was even talk of a peace dividend. And this was something that became popular by Bush, by Thatcher, later by Clinton. And they said, now the Cold War is over and we have untrammeled domination over the world. We can see actually the possibilities for an enormous reallocation of resources. We don't have to build up our military anymore. This is all kind of surplus to requirement. Instead, we could even see a situation where arms factories are repurposed, people that work in that trade are reskilled, and so on and so forth. At this time as well, it's crazy to think about now, but there was even discussions about what the future of NATO should be. You know, like the US Secretary of State made a promise that if the Russians agreed to Germany being unified, they would not expand 1 inch eastward. At that time as well, people in America were saying, well, the Soviet Union has collapsed, and given the fact that this was an anti-Soviet aggressive military pact, what's the purpose of it? You know, there was even talk about disbanding NATO in some quarters. And
it's extraordinary.
it is when you relate it to today. And one other thing was, and I think especially under Bill Clinton, was this idea of kind of going on a diplomatic crusade through all of the troubled parts of the world. And of course, what we saw in the 90s was the Oslo Accords, which the imperialists praised themselves to the heavens and back for, right? Bringing peace to this disquiet part of the world. You even began to see the United States put pressure on the Arab regimes to normalize relations with Israel. Also, in this period, we saw the Good Friday Agreement as well, which, in a very similar way, a brutally partitioned country was basically a fake peace was made. And of course, this is all kind of collapsing today.
Yeah, exactly. And as you say, they had this triumphant feeling that we've sorted it out, guys. You know, now that the US, we're so powerful, we can be the policeman, we can just make these agreements all over the world and usher in this era of peace. But it was all a lie. It was a lie. And actually, in that time still, and then at the turning point of the 21st century, the US actually was dragging much of the rest of the West, in particular Britain, into new horrifying wars. In particular, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the war on terror that they began and started, which destroyed millions of lives across Iraq and Afghanistan. And even beyond that, they went to many different countries in their rampage, and they basically had this foreign policy. We say is 9/11 basically gave America this perfect excuse that they could just use this threat, the idea of the threat against American interests, where they could go into any country that wasn't working in a way that they wanted and just destroy it, not only through economic measures, but militarily and through bombs, and to push for regime change in a lot of different countries. But when you look back now, 20 years later, on places like Iraq and Afghanistan, not only did they destroy these countries, but they also didn't achieve what they wanted. And that isn't just our analysis. Actually, if you look at the analysis of architect of US imperialism, there's a quote from Henry Kissinger, not originally about Iraq and Afghanistan, it's actually about Vietnam, where he says, basically, America lost because we did not win. And it is this idea, well, hold on a minute, if, as we were saying earlier, they were this superpower, they were the world's policemen, they should have, in theory, been able to go into the world and into the Middle East and into these particular countries and achieve what they wanted, regime change, and set up mini colonies that just act in the way that they wanted, purely facilitating US imperialist interests. But that's not what's taken place. Actually, they've destabilized these countries and the region massively, and in turn created much of the problems that we're seeing today, which has a massive knock-on effect in the West. But as I say, it wasn't just Iraq and Afghanistan. This war on terror is stretched into the Philippines, Pakistan, Somalia, which has also produced a lot of refugees, which we'll come on to later, and they spent trillions. $8 trillion, it's estimated, was spent on the war on terror. And that has also produced a lot of soul searching and questioning in American society. What was this all for?
In a very big way. And just to go with those two examples, in Iraq, it really swelled their heads when they were able to get rid of Saddam Hussein in one fell swoop. But what did the Americans do? They looked at sectarian countries in the region, such as Lebanon, and they thought, we'll bring in a constitution like that. And in fact, this has really diminished US influence over Iraq, which is a failed state due to the invasion. It's actually meant they invited back a lot of political dissidents from Iran, and Iran has stretched its influence into Iraq as a result. I think the case of Afghanistan as well is particularly stark, because you had a situation where the US fought its longest ever war with an insurgent force, only for in 2021 Biden to pull out in a Saigon-style evacuation, right? And what did we see? The puppet regime of Ghani fell almost immediately, and the Taliban were reinstated into power.
Yeah, well, also those images of people fleeing, of them trying to get out, it was humiliation for the US and for Biden specifically.
In a very big way. And there's been different aspects of the war on terror that I think have shown the utter hypocrisy of US imperialism and revealed that in the eyes of a very radicalized generation.
Yes,
I mean,
women's rights.
Women's rights, oh God, don't get me started.
Which is what they, parroted all around the world. And actually, as you just said, they facilitated the return of the Taliban.
Yes. And one other example, which I remember having a very radicalizing effect on me, was the Syrian civil war, where you had this distinction in the Western media between the so-called moderate rebel and the so-called extreme rebel. And what that was there to facilitate was the backing of jihadi groups that were turning the country, a very strong, powerful country at a certain point, in the Arab world into a playground for sectarian violence and Islamism. So that was the consequence of their involvement in the Syrian civil war. There's also the bombing of NATO, the bombing by NATO of Libya, which saw what? It saw one of the wealthiest nations in the Arab world turned into, once again, a failed state, where now in Tripoli, in the major cities, people are traded as slaves. There's also been the total destruction of Yemen as well, the Saudi-backed effort there. And I think this is what people are beginning to understand. This war on terror pretext that you were describing really exposed that the biggest terrorist organization on the planet is the United States of America.
Absolutely. And that really resonates with millions of people all around the world, not just in the Arab world, actually. I mean, we make this point again and again that, US imperialism is the most reactionary force on the planet. And actually, there is no other force that has destroyed as many lives as US imperialism. The war on terror was a pretext for the US to use brutal violence wherever it wanted just to shore up its own economic interests. But it has done this in many different ways all around the world. But what it did in that period, in that kind of post 9/11 time frame, was produce, and this is according to the UN, over 38 million people across Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, the Philippines, Libya, Syria. All of these people were displaced within their own countries. And some of them have tried to leave those countries, of course, and go to neighboring countries, which are also suffering under the might of US imperialism and Western imperialism more broadly. But yeah, it's not just in that region of the world, also in Latin America, which has been ravaged also by US imperialism for a long time. Just this week, we are witnessing and have been discussing how Donald Trump has ramped up his imperialist kind of bullying against Venezuela. There's a whole wing to Trump's cabinet, Marco Rubio. These like kind of mad war hawks who are really obsessed with pushing for regime change in Venezuela and Cuba, which they see as in their sphere of influence. This is America's backyard, and they want to maintain control of it. They don't want other powers like China or anything else getting their foot in the door, which is what is taking place. But in all of these places, there is a deep, seething hatred towards US imperialism, which has radicalized people in quite a powerful way. Because if you have the most powerful capitalist, country coming into your country, destroying it, that's going to politicize you. You're not going to forget that very easily. So that mood has developed and has now had a knock-on effect, we would say, in the West.
Yes.
And that's what's very significant about this time period that we're living through. As you say, there was this ideological justification for the war on terror, which we have to say probably worked for a long amount of time. There was a lot of fear whipped up in America, but also more broadly in the West. People do and did broadly agree in this idea of democracy and human rights and women's rights and so on and so forth. But that has all been shattered. The lie has been exposed to millions of people. And that's what we mean when we say, through the Palestine movement today in particular, all of that accumulated disgust at what Western imperialism has really done. You have not brought peace anywhere in the world. You've just brought destruction. That has radicalized a whole generation of young people. Also because it's not just history. It wasn't just 20 or 30 years ago. The Palestine movement is happening today because today, in the last 2 years, Israel which acts as the main Western imperialist outlet or outpost in the region, has continued this destruction. In the last 2 years, Israel attacked Gaza, the West Bank, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, all with the full support, Qatar, all with the full support of the US and Britain. I remember when Keir Starmer was talking about moving ships to all of this is happening right now, and it's awoken people up to the history of Western imperialism, but also what it does today. And that means there's a whole generation of anti-war kind of young people that are growing up, which is not a good thing from the point of view of the ruling class.
Absolutely not. Yes. And I think it's been good to start with the war on terror context, because that really is the backdrop to how people view the things that their politicians say. And you're completely right that Israel is this outpost or bridgehead of Western imperialism in the Middle East. And I would say that the arrogance that exists in the West, that we rule the roost, we're the big boys and we can do as we please. You find that arrogance in a even more distilled and concentrated form within Israel. There is this singular exceptionalism to the way that Israel acts. This concept of waging war without end is really almost part of the DNA of Israel.
Well, they're the only democracy in the Middle East.
Apparently so. Apparently so. And a lot of
genocide.
the lovely, sweet, enlightened democracies in the West have grown quite frustrated, we should say, with Israel's conduct over the last 2 years. Not because their hearts bleed for the Palestinians or anything like that, because it has exposed the utter hypocrisy of their system.
Yeah.
What is their system built upon? It's built upon institutions like the UN, which are there to basically use, to have this playbook of a rules-based order. What's that been used for? It's a tool in the hands of US imperialism to attack your enemies and to never ever really be used against your friends. However, the Israeli strategy over the last 2 years of trying to use the attack of October 7th to pursue the historic ends of Zionism, of conquering the whole of historic Palestine, of expelling and exterminating as many Palestinians as they can, it's really shown that the rules-based order is a complete and utter sham. And what has that meant for Western leaders? The mask has slipped in a way that I don't think could be more obvious, right?
Yes.
When a genocide is live streamed to your phone and things are justified time and time again by your rulers. So that has obviously radicalized people. And I would say all of that accumulated hatred and frustration finds itself on the streets when you're protesting for Palestine.
Yeah, I think the mask has slipped is exactly the way to describe what is happening. Because the truth is, today in 2025, we should say we live in a time of war. And that is seeping into consciousness. Actually, I remember we were quoting this a lot last year, I think. It was I don't know how they measured it, but it was like the kids' words of the year. And the top words of the year were, from children, were climate change and war, which shows just how deep into society this idea of war is becoming.
We should say 10 years ago when we were much younger, the word of the year was minions. When the movie came out.
There you go. Well, yeah, I mean, that says a lot about this isn't just an older generation thinking about it. It's young people, because it's surrounding everything that is happening. And so people are thinking about it. And so people are trying to understand, well, why is it happening? Because, as we said at the start, the period of war was supposed to be over. We thought, hasn't the US defeated it? We don't even need NATO anymore. This idea of advanced Western liberal capitalism has arrived onto the scene of history, and everyone else should slowly just try to become more like us. That was basically what people thought. But that has been shattered. And as you say, the mask has slipped. And so I think what's important is that we explain, well, why has war returned? I mean, the reality is it never really went away. And it's important for us to explain it because I would say there's like 3 different kind of narratives or explanations for war that we receive in society through media, through politicians, and probably also through school history books that range from the right wing to the left. And you have the kind of dominant right-wing narrative, which with Trump in power now, although ironically he presented himself as a peace candidate, he has a side to his cabinet, as I said earlier, which is kind of war hawk mad. Marco Rubio, who's the Secretary of State, Pete Hegseth, who I think is the Secretary for Defense.
Of War now, I think.
Oh yeah, they've renamed the department from Defense to War. I mean, that says it all, doesn't it? And these people say very openly, very nakedly, in order to defend capitalist interests, I mean, they don't say the word capitalism. National interests, we need regime change in Venezuela. We need regime change in Cuba. These wars, this is necessary in order for us to secure our when they say national interests, they mean essentially profits.
And domination.
And domination. Imperialism is not just about access to raw materials, so that does play a massive role, like oil. It's also about their sphere of influence more generally, which is what the US is very concerned with at the moment. And they're very open about it. I remember when that group chat was leaked, for example, when they were celebrating the killing of Houthis, when they, it's just so naked and very blatant. So you see that. A lot of people are a bit disgusted by that because they're like, you've gone a bit too far. And one wing of people who are disgusted by that are liberals, right? The liberal approach to war that you receive, which is a bit more, this is what you're going to get in The Guardian, and which is basically that, war is bad, it's sad, it's terrible, it's dreadful to have to look at this. But unfortunately, it probably is necessary, because of things like democracy, human rights and whatever. The liberal kind of presentation of it is a bit more dishonest, basically, but ultimately still justifies that war. And I think that something that really exposed that was actually when Joe Biden was in power in America. I mean, of course, he became known as Genocide Joe because he launched and funded and was, diehard for Israel. Historically has always been a Zionist, but also was trying to, chart this path of, it is sad, but it is ultimately still necessary, and we don't like to see what's happening in Gaza, but Israel has the right to defend itself. He was a big part of shattering that liberal myth of we stand for decency in the world. And there's another example, I think, like closer to home in Britain, which is Rory Stewart. I think Rory Stewart's a really good archetype of the kind of somewhat liberal response to these things. Rory Stewart, actually, if you look at his history as a politician, I mean, he initially supported the war in Iraq, but has subsequently written and said a lot of things about how actually it was a scandal, it was a mistake, it should have never happened, which is always what liberals do. When it's taking place, they justify it, but then afterwards they say, "Oh, actually, that was a bit wrong, and that was a bit sad."
So useless, precisely at moments when a staunch stance is needed.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a recent clip of him that's gone viral where he's arguing with Michael Gove over Israel.
And when I was at the Labour Party conference, I asked Owen Jones why he spent all his time criticising Israel and didn't show any concern for Sudan or for what was happening in Xinjiang.
And could it possibly be that Sudan is not presented as our central ally? That Sudan is not a country that the United States has been providing billions of dollars of direct military support to? That Sudan has not been at the center of our entire political structures for 60, 70 years in the way that and that actually, to compare Israel to Sudan, given that Israel is a liberal democracy and one of our closest allies, is profoundly patronizing to Israel. If Denmark suddenly started doing something and I said, well, how come you're not criticizing Congo in the same way that you're criticizing Denmark? The answer would be Israel would hope to be held to a higher standard than Sudan.
As now you do see a lot of liberals now saying, oh, I think Israel's gone a little bit far, it actually, we can't really justify it. They're supposed to be a democratic ally and they're not acting in a democratic way. Yes. And you can see this internal contradiction between him and Michael Gove of basically the ruling class and the capitalist system trying to marry up their economic interests, which is we need a strong Israel to fight to secure Western imperialism in the region, versus, but that requires the genocide of the Palestinian people, which is angering and causing internal, conflict in our own country.
Yes.
The liberal explanation for war is dishonest, and because it's dishonest, it's meaningless. It reduces everything down, or tries to reduce things down to ideology. It's about strong men or weak men. People say, oh, Putin is just this mad man. Trump, also a mad man. But actually, Trump's foreign policy is not, it's a little bit different from Biden's, but it's still rooted in the general needs of US imperialism.
Of course, yeah.
It just takes on a slightly different flavor. And finally, you have what the left, I suppose, broadly puts out about war, which they would point the finger at the ruling class, I think correctly. But often something I see, this idea on the left that wars are the product of ideology. In the main, people talk about white supremacy. They talk about the US being built on a white supremacist view of the world, and that racism feeds its dehumanization of Arab people or Muslim people or Asian people, and it believes it's their kind of God-given right to dominate the world. And we were saying that earlier as well. And ideology obviously becomes an important justification for war. But when you focus on that too much, then you detach yourself from the economic interests that are driving that war. And the flip side to focusing on ideology is they end up basically blaming the working class for not being able to fight that ideology, for absorbing it and just being too passive then in the struggle against war. This idea, well, if the working class weren't so racist and didn't buy into the idea that Arab people or Muslim people or anyone around the world should be dominated, then that war wouldn't happen.
Yes.
Which I think is a very simplistic and untrue statement.
Is very false. And having a clear idea as to why wars take place is absolutely paramount at a time where, as you say, there's never been more conflicts in the world. And something I think also the left do often put forward is this idea of the military-industrial complex as the key source for wars and conflicts within the world. And this is probably the closest the left get to an economic argument of trying to understand imperialism in economic terms. And you know who recently died?
Oh, sorry.
Dick Cheney.
Well, no apologies.
I saw a meme that came out and what did it say? Dick Cheney has invaded hell.
Yeah.
But obviously he is a particular case where, of course, this guy was an architect for the Iraq War, and he also sat on the board of Halliburton, which was a major contractor for oil and security services in Iraq. And people will point at this and say, well, this is the imperialist trick. They bomb a country into smithereens and then they rebuild it, right? And they make a killing in the process.
Yeah.
And obviously arms profiteering is an aspect of wars. We have to say some people are looking at this geopolitical fragmentation and licking their lips or laughing their way to the bank.
Yeah.
I mean, when you read what the top brass of so-called defense companies are saying at the moment, they're talking about the need to basically make more bombs. And, of course, they're putting pressure on governments and so on and so forth. So profiteering is an aspect of war. And we should point that out. War is terribly profitable. It's something that Lenin himself said. Yeah. However, I feel like if you leave your explanation at this point, it becomes quite conspiratorial, right? Yeah. And fundamentally, it's not correct. So how do Marxists understand war? Well, we base ourselves on what Clausewitz said, that war is a continuation of politics by different means. And I think the addition of what Lenin said really helps concretize this. He said, in order to understand politics, you have to understand it as concentrated economics. So what economic age do we live in? We live in an age where monopolies completely dominate every aspect of our lives, right? And as we spoke about last week, they have no social responsibility to society. The thing they're concerned about is profits, right? Maximizing their profits. And at a certain point in the development of capitalism over 100 years ago, we saw that the forces of production, what can be produced, far outstripped what the internal or the home market could really absorb. And so the national market becomes too narrow. And so there is this kind of natural tendency within the economic system to push past that, right? To begin to export things elsewhere. What facilitates this? Well, this is the role that the nation state plays in the economy, right? Marx had this wonderful phrase that the state is there to manage the common affairs of the bourgeois class. And Engels added to that, he said that to reduce the state, this monopoly on violence to one thing, it would be armed bodies of men. You have the police here at home and the army abroad, right? This is a necessary part of basically making sure that capital's diktats are carried out, right? So for a capitalist, for a nation, it's not just enough to maintain your spheres of influence. There is this drive to increase your market share, right? To, as Lenin would say, to basically become the biggest slave owner of them all. And so wars take place between capitalist powers, usually as a result of competition for world markets, for world hegemony, right? But not everything has to be settled this way. We don't think that every conflict or friction between two powers will necessarily lead to a war. In fact, there are other means of throwing your weight around, and the economic side of things is very important in understanding this as well. You know, before the US feels the need to send in gunboats, it will usually send a letter from the US Board of Trade, or there'll be a visit from an IMF official.
Yeah.
But when push comes to shove and the contradictions grow so great between different powers or vying imperialist blocs, what you will find is that all of these people that talk about democracy and so on and so forth, they'll dispatch their missiles, they'll send their boots to, the working class to go fight their wars and so on. And so I think we have to understand it that way, that militarism is a direct consequence of imperialism. And this is what forces nations into seeking military supremacy, right? And expanding their reach through military bases and so on and so forth. So that's, I think, our disagreement with this idea on the left. It's that military power is a function of economic power, not the other way around.
Yeah.
It's not that you have a strong military and then the economy catches up. In fact, if you have a strong economy, you're going to want to dominate the world market.
Exactly.
You need a military to help out with that, right?
Yeah. And this opening up of the world, you know, you described very aptly and concisely the kind of the rise of imperialism. What's happened on the world stage and the world market with globalization and everything means that the whole world now is connected much more strongly in a way that it wasn't in the past. And that's true of industries, but that's also true of people, the working class. They're much more connected, much more in tune with what is going on all around the world. And so that means if war is taking place on the other side of the world, that can still have an impact on the consciousness of people on the other side of the world.
Yes.
Especially, as I was saying at the start, in Western imperialist countries, which are the source of much of the war and conflict we're seeing unfold. And I think it was important for us to give that explanation, because what we have found in our work as the RCP, and I'd say just more broadly, if you talk to anyone in society, is people are asking, what is going on, right? We've had the war in Ukraine, we've had the genocide in Gaza, but also people are looking at places like Sudan and places like Congo, where there is absolute human catastrophe, and people are trying to understand that. The scale of the conflict, the scale of the slaughter in Sudan and Congo is really extreme, even more extreme than Palestine, actually, in terms of the official numbers. And it's important for us to have a bit of an understanding so that people, because I think there is this deep questioning of the military industrial, you know, people, you mentioned arms industry, and I think that's very important because, you know, I think through the Palestine movement, obviously one of the key demands has been to stop selling arms to Israel. And correctly, people have instinctively understood, in the case of Sudan, for example, how that same demand should be kind of transplanted across, that we shouldn't be selling arms to the UAE, which is funding absolute barbarism in Sudan. We have to start there, right? This phrase, socialism or barbarism, which is used a lot on the left, but it's not an empty phrase. It is real life in the case of somewhere like Sudan, where 150,000 people have been slaughtered, have been killed. There are 10 million refugees. There are 1.5 million people dying of starvation, and that is predicted to quadruple on the current basis. There is a genocide in Darfur. And what you have is this kind of army, this kind of gangster army, the Rapid Support Forces, which is a counter-revolutionary force which uses the most extreme violence and rape as a weapon against the Sudanese people, the Sudanese masses. And they are armed by the UAE, who, as I was saying earlier, people have realized the West sells arms to. And how Sudan has ended up in this situation is also the result of essentially a failed revolution.
Yes.
There was an incredible revolution and revolutionary wave that erupted in Sudan. And I remember watching the videos of women leading incredible protests and speaking to people, doing amazing speeches, poetry, art. All of this was coming out. You had mini committees, defense committees set up. We have material coming out on our website and in our podcast that goes into much more detail about Sudan, which I encourage people to look at and to study. But unfortunately, that was ultimately unsuccessful. The workers could have taken power in Sudan. They actually had power in their hands, but that was unsuccessful. And we should say the UK, the US, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE wanted to see that revolutionary wave stopped. And so they have helped facilitate, along with other powers, the complete attempted annihilation, actually, of the revolution and of people in Sudan. And this, again, it's important for us to look and study, understand, like, how is the West always involved? Also, again, Sudan, many years ago, Britain was involved in colonization, all of these things. Yes. The legacy of imperialism is deep. And we have to understand that from a historical basis, but also politically to know how to fight it today. Same is also true in Congo, where the current conflict, which isn't just a random thing that's happening today, you have to understand it by looking back. There's this endless cycle of violence, of wars that actually follow the Rwandan genocide, which took place in 1994. And ever since then, you've had a whole host of different forces, different armed groups. I think actually 120 armed groups have tried to get involved, especially in the East, because of the vast amounts of mineral wealth, the resources that exist in Congo that they want. And it's a tragedy when you look at what has happened in Congo. Again, millions of people have suffered. And Western imperialism plays a role because in Congo in particular, you have neighboring countries, Rwanda, Uganda, they're all involved in the destabilization of Congo. The reason that the West is involved is because all around the world, the West wants outposts. All around the world, Western imperialism needs countries, it needs places that can be used as a base to secure their interests in other places. So you even have, in the case of Rwanda, the EU has given Rwanda lots of money in the past so that Rwanda will then send its army and its forces to protect its interests in neighboring countries. Yes. That is the function of imperialism today. And it is not just the West that does this, by the way. There is a redivision happening on the global stage of different imperialist powers. And actually, we are living through a relative decline of the US, which means that you have rising imperialist powers like China or like Russia, which are increasingly playing a massive role, particularly in Africa and in African countries, and in this region in particular. And that means that regional conflicts, like in Sudan, like in Congo, are happening more and more because there isn't just one sole imperialist power that runs the world. There's actually competing powers who are trying to get as much of the loot that they can. And this is producing absolute devastation. It is producing barbarism already.
For sure. And this is something we've discussed for this whole year in the RCP and across the sections of the RCI as well, is this tectonic shift in world relations. A resurgent Russia, a strong, dynamic China that's beginning to challenge the sclerotic power of the United States, which we should say is still the foremost imperialist power. Militarily, economically, it is still the strongest. However, it cannot assert itself in the way it once thought, and it once did as well. And that is a significant part of our understanding of the world situation. I wanted to plug some things, if I can.
Please.
Because Revolution Festival is coming up very soon.
Yes.
We have a talk that's going to be given by one of our leading members, Hamid, on multipolarity, which is what we've been describing. The plenary session on the Friday night, where Fiona will be speaking alongside Alan Woods, our leading theoretician, will be on specifically this question. What is taking place in the world and how does Britain fit into that? And one final plug, which is a book I bought and I read at the start of the year, Colossus, which will be on our book stall at Revolution Festival. is an absolutely brilliant guide to explain the relative decline of US imperialism and the challenges that it faces at the moment. It's been very helpful for us to use it to prepare for this podcast.
That was very naturally done.
Thank you. But I think we should talk a little bit about Ukraine, because obviously that has been a key theatre through which the US has tried to assert its dominance for the last 30 years, we should say.
And people don't know because it is not spoken about, particularly in Britain. There's very, very little coverage about the war in Ukraine, and any coverage that is given is a lie.
Yes, yeah. And how different to 3 years ago.
Yeah.
When Russia invaded in February 2022, it almost felt like we were at war as a country.
Yeah,
right?
And the Ukraine flag was everywhere. People were encouraged. I remember even doing talks at universities, by the way, and seeing posters. I remember in King's College London, there were posters where you could donate directly, not to like a charity force, but essentially to the Ukrainian army in some capacity. I mean, the level of propaganda was extraordinary.
Yes.
And it was very hard to speak out against this, actually, against the drive to war with Ukraine.
Yes, for sure. And that's why background is so necessary, because we talked about the collapse of the Soviet Union and the hubris of the US, hubris of the European Union as well. It wasn't just the US that felt like it could expand its spheres of influence.
Yeah.
There very much was an eastward march from particularly a unified Germany to the east into the old spheres of influence of Russia. And in 2014, which was a significant turning point in Ukraine's history, Ukraine was devastated by the collapse of the Soviet Union, we should say, and you had the oligarchs come to power, and they would basically yo-yo between the Western sphere of influence and the Eastern sphere of influence. But in 2014, in part of a CIA-orchestrated coup, the Maidan movement took place, which saw a big rupture between Ukraine looking towards the East and looking far more to the West. In this situation, we saw the far right emboldened massively, openly fascist elements operating within the state as well, and the revival of figures like Stepan Bandera, a known Nazi collaborator from the 30s. Anyway, all of this crap was dragged to the surface. And in this situation, the European Union was promising that Ukraine could join the Europe Club, right? Yeah. It dangled the prospect of economic prosperity in the form of EU membership. It said, look at Poland, there's been a financial miracle there. It promised as well military security in the form of NATO membership. And this was enough to basically harden the resolve of a figure like Zelensky to want to basically turn Ukraine into a client state for the West.
Yes.
And so he wasn't elected on this basis, but you know, there was more and more war hysteria around this. And as I think we mentioned last week, it was all about security concerns, the concerns of Russia. And just one example I like to give is, can you imagine what the US would have done if a rival power tried to install nuclear weapons or intercontinental ballistic missiles on its border?
Yeah.
If Russia or China tried to do that in Canada?
Yeah.
Well, we don't actually have to think, because there is an example from the 1960s of where Russia did send nuclear warheads to Cuba, and the US brought the world almost to the point of nuclear annihilation, right?
Yeah.
So for those people that say, who is Russia to say this has security concerns and so on and so forth? Anyway, it was this bellicose attitude of the West that led to the outbreak of war. We should make that very clear. And nothing tests socialists like war, right? We have said from the beginning that this is an inter-imperialist conflict between Russia and the US, plague on both their houses, right? We are not in either camp. We stand for working class solidarity and internationalism. But I think the left were really fooled on this particular question. Yeah. People were saying, well, Russia was the one that sent in tanks, so shouldn't we support then the Ukrainian forces in the West? Maybe the West actually have got it right this time, right? And maybe it is about democracy and so on.
Yeah, you're right. And again, it's back down to like understanding war as somehow being the product of individuals or ideologies, or in the most kind of simplistic or great, good versus evil, this kind of thing, which is basically how you're taught about it in bourgeois history. We are taught always to think of war and society and conflict basically in this idealistic form, that it is, it's the product of different ideologies kind of battling it out. Western liberal democracy against autocracy, which in this case would be the form of Russia is the, autocratic, whatever state, and Ukraine and Europe is the democratic liberal one. And people, they tend to forget history, and we should say fundamentally forget a basic working class internationalist position on war, and understand in that example the role of Western imperialism and the US and NATO continually encroaching on Russia. And sometimes when we explain, how the war has taken place, it's, as you say, people worry or panic that you're somehow justifying the war from Russia's point of view, which is completely false. What we are explaining is the logic of the capitalist system itself and how it produces war. And that is the logic of imperialism. That is not our logic at all. We are just analyzing it correctly. And if you don't like what you're hearing, well, that's because of you don't like the capitalist system itself and its inevitable drive to war. And it's very, very important for us to explain it, because otherwise, you're trapped in this position. And, recently, actually, we saw this with Zara Sultana. She said in an interview that Zelensky is not a friend of the working class in Ukraine. And she mentioned this conference that she'd been at where she discussed with people in, some left-wing people in Russia and some left-wing people in Ukraine. I can't really remember the details. And she got a lot of backlash for it, which reveals the fact that the left still hasn't had a proper reckoning or understanding of the war in Ukraine. It was actually a breath of fresh air to hear someone put forward or attempt to put forward a bit of a left-wing position on the war in Ukraine and point out, in a kind of slightly way, in a partial way, I would say, a class position on the war. She said the only people profiting from this war are arms manufacturers. And that's partially true, but we should also explain the logic of the imperialist system itself. Otherwise, it's not enough. And I think that's why she's received a bit of backlash for it, perhaps.
And we can go much further as well. The people that swear by peace are the ones that are most determined or hell-bent on war.
Exactly.
The British imperialists in particular have played
they went crazy.
A treacherous role in continuing and prolonging and protracting a brutal war. Boris
Johnson flew to Ukraine to try to stop Zelensky from signing a deal. And Boris Johnson, like many other, they use war. They use the Ukrainian people as just cannon fodder. He was doing that to distract from his own crises at home, the absolute scandal over COVID and the parties and the sleaze and so on. But that was then continued by Keir Starmer, who also has played a treacherous role, promised to give Ukraine £3 billion a year for as long as it takes, no matter what it takes. We're with Ukraine 100%, which is basically we will allow the death of tens of thousands and into the 100,000 of Ukrainians in order to continue our partnership with the US and our role on the world stage, which is just to do whatever the US wants.
For sure. And let's call a spade a spade. This war has been a great power struggle between different imperialist blocs, and Russia is winning. It has won decisively on the battlefield, and we don't know exactly when the war will end, but this has actually exposed in a very strong way the limits of US power. They threw lots of money, lots of resources at it. And in fact, they dragged the Europeans in many cases into the war. But what Trump is now trying to do is disentangle the US from the war. Why? To shield the embarrassment and the humiliation of US imperialism from losing out, right? And so he's actually embarrassing and humiliating the Europeans in such an obvious way. He's you know, they're running around doing their summits, their Zoom calls, going to the Oval Office. They have this phrase for it. It's called gratitude diplomacy, where you thank Trump before he even speaks. Basically, it shows the servile role of the European powers, really.
Yeah.
But he's more interested in trying to strike something up with Putin himself, right?
Yeah.
Which, in my opinion, is the clearest illustration that this was never about Ukrainian sovereignty.
Exactly.
Trump recognizes, no matter how conscious, that this was always a battle between the US and Russia. And in fact, now is more conscious than others, especially the Europeans, that the war has in fact been lost. And of course, this has meant the European rulers are spiraling at the moment. They don't know what to do, what to make of it. And we see this craze of militarism in sweeping across the whole of Europe at the moment, with many governments saying that they're going to raise defense spending by something to something like 5%, at a time where all of these economies more or less are stagnant. And so where does that have to come from?
Yes.
From social spending, from a tax on the working class.
Exactly. What's going to happen is the working class of Europe is being forced to pay for the war in Ukraine, basically, and all the subsequent militarism that Europe is now on a rampage about, and is trying to whip up fear in the working class, saying a threat from Russia is imminent. And they're doing this in Europe, and they're doing it in Britain, and saying, therefore, we all need to kind of cut things together. We need to, you know, become one nation again for the greater good because of this threat of war. But I don't think it's cutting through in the same way because of everything we were saying before. There's this kind of anti-war generation that has been growing up. And also, more importantly, the conditions of the working class in Europe have been under attack for the last 10 years. What is being promised now is even more, billions and billions and billions of euros worth of cuts in a continent where industry is in a massive decline. We've got a lot of material on our website about how the productivity in Europe has been declining. If you look at things like the car industry, it's an example of how Europe has been living in this kind of bloated way.
Yeah.
Also, we should say, because the US for decades supported Europe, which was a great deal for Europe. It meant that they didn't have to spend a lot of money on things like militarism and defense. Because the US were like, okay, we'll deal with all of this because we want a bulwark against the Soviet Union and a bulwark against Russia. But now Trump's like, actually, I want to focus more on China. We're not going to give you all of this money. So Europe is in this existential contradiction where it wants to spend billions on its military, and it has to justify that by ideologically whipping up the fear of war from Russia. Meanwhile, workers in Europe are thinking, hold on a minute, it's my own government that's attacking me right now, right? It's my own government that is causing these cuts to take place. And so it's in this contradiction that it's going to really struggle to move to progress with,
for sure,
I would say.
For sure. And something that we're starting to see across Europe, a little bit in Britain, but maybe not as much as closer towards Russia, is this question of security coming up a lot. I mean, you did a debate with Tobias Elwood, whatever that guy's called, where he was basically talking about this resurgent Russia and the threat that posed to democracy. And of course, it's always wrapped up in like liberal values and so on and so forth. Yeah. But what interests is Russia threatening? It's the imperialist interests of the Europeans. I don't think it's any surprise that Britain and France were the first to rally behind this idea of a coalition of the willing. You know, partially it was a political thing. You know, Starmer liked his moment in the sunlight where he could pretend to be Churchill and Macron pretending to be de Gaulle. But why is it? It's actually because of the foreign direct investment both of these countries have in Africa. And what does a resurgent Russia with great military clout look like? It looks like the continued kicking out of, or elbowing out of, the interests of British and French imperialism. And we should also say very clearly that the people that make the world a more dangerous place reside in the Oval Office, reside in the British Parliament, in all of the European capitals. These people have really played with fire during this war. Some of the stuff the European leaders have been saying is crazy.
If you look at, we don't have time, we're running out of time, but if you look at things that the Danish prime ministers, like these people have been whipping up and trying to expand the war, lengthen the war. Starmer wanted to use these Storm Shadow missiles to launch attacks into Russia. Again, expand the war. So this is our point when these people, and Tobias did it, oh, Russia's, trying to attack us. We do not trust the ruling class of our own countries to keep us safe because they are part and parcel of dragging the world into war again and again, whether they want to or not as individuals. The whole imperialist system, the capitalist system, is dragging all of these countries into conflict with one another. And these people are not keeping us safe. They are actually making the world completely unsafe. Therefore, the only war that the working class has an interest in is a war against their own ruling class, a war against the capitalists and the imperialists who create misery all around the world and create misery through austerity and through their attacks in our country every single day as well.
Yeah, in a very big way. And if we're to summarize, hopefully this episode has showed the importance of a theoretical understanding of war and imperialism. Of course, there's far more that can be said. Again, I'll do another plug. People should read Lenin's Imperialism.
Absolutely.
It's a fantastic guide for understanding the economic process, and it's truer today than even when it was written. But there are key questions socialists have to be able to answer. Why do wars happen? Why is militarism taking place? And which class can end all wars, as you say? The working class has no interest in imperialist plunder and the misery that is exported all across the world. In fact, it's not only the class that has no interest in it, but it's the class that can stop it. And I think sometimes when the left look around the world today, it is a very dismal sight to see genocides taking place, silent wars that are not even really discussed in the mainstream media. But what we're trying to get across is that all of this war, barbarism, is preparing the way for the war that can end all wars, which will be the class war.
Thank you, Khaled.
Thank you.